Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little unsettling, but in that soft, distant way that history sometimes is. The kind of unsettling that feels less like a scream and more like a slow creak in an old wooden house. So, dim the lights a little. Maybe pull the blanket up just a bit higher. And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's oddly comforting, knowing people all over the world are drifting off to the same strange corners of history. Tonight, we're easing into the quiet, uncomfortable world of what happened to people accused of witchcraft, and it turns out it wasn't great. But it also wasn't always what you imagine. It wasn't constant chaos and fire and shouting. More often, it was slow, bureaucratic, awkward, sometimes almost painfully mundane. Because accusing someone of witchcraft, oddly enough, often began in the most ordinary ways. A cow stops giving milk. A child gets sick. Butter refuses to churn, which apparently was a deeply emotional issue for medieval households. And instead of thinking that's unfortunate, someone would quietly think, that woman down the road did look at me a bit strangely yesterday. And just like that, a life could begin to unravel. Now, let's float gently into a small village. Just a scattering of wooden homes, a dirt path, maybe a church sitting slightly off-center. In this village lives a woman, not particularly remarkable, not especially powerful. In fact, she's often a little on the margins. Maybe she's older, maybe she's unmarried. Maybe she talks to herself sometimes, which honestly isn't a crime. But in a place where everyone watches everyone else, it becomes a personality trait that people remember. And that's the first quiet pattern you'll notice. The people accused of witchcraft were rarely the most powerful. They were usually the most available. It's that they were already a little outside the comfortable center of society, which made them convenient. Now, when the accusation finally comes, it doesn't arrive like a dramatic courtroom scene. No one bursts through a door shouting. Instead, it spreads. A whisper here, a comment there. She's strange. She mutters things. My bread went bad after she visited. And over time, these small, unimpressive complaints start to stack up like papers on a desk no one wants to clear. Eventually, someone decides it's serious enough to tell a local authority. And this is where things take on that very particular historical tone, where something deeply irrational becomes wrapped in very official procedures. Because once the accusation is formal, it becomes paperwork. Statements are taken, witnesses are called. People who barely remember what happened yesterday suddenly become very confident about what they saw 3 months ago. Memory, as it turns out, is extremely flexible when there's social pressure involved. And then there's the accused, who is now expected to respond. And here's the strange part, there is no correct response. If she denies it, well, that's exactly what a witch would do. If she hesitates, clearly hiding something. If she becomes emotional, unstable, possibly possessed. If she remains calm, suspiciously calm. It's a bit of a no-win situation, and the people questioning her don't necessarily see themselves as villains. They often believe they are protecting their community. They're thinking something is wrong and we need to fix it, which historically speaking has led to some very questionable decisions. Now, let's slow things down even further, because before we get to the more famous punishments, there's a long stretch of waiting. Interrogations don't happen instantly. The accused might be held somewhere, not necessarily a dungeon, sometimes just a room where they are kept under watch. And during this time, something interesting happens. The pressure builds, not just from authorities, but from isolation. Because imagine being taken from your daily life and told that everyone around you believes you might be in league with dark forces, even if you know it's not true. After days or weeks, that certainty starts to feel quieter, and doubt, even if it's small, begins to creep in. Not, am I a witch exactly, but more like, How do I prove I'm not? And that question is where things begin to slip, because proving a negative is famously difficult. Now, depending on the place and time, the next step varies. Some regions leaned heavily on formal trials, others preferred creative methods of determining guilt. Deeply flawed, but presented with surprising confidence. One of the most well-known ideas was that witches had certain physical markers. Marks on the skin, areas that didn't feel pain. So naturally, officials would examine the accused, very carefully, very thoroughly, which was not exactly a comfortable experience. And here's where things get almost quietly absurd. Human bodies have imperfections. Everyone has marks, moles, scars, and if you're actively searching for something unusual, you will absolutely find it. It's like looking for shapes in clouds. So the examination, which was meant to reveal truth, often just reinforced suspicion. Now, let's gently drift into one of the more famous methods, the idea of testing a witch. At some point, people decided that if accusations weren't enough, they needed something more definitive, something dramatic. Take, for example, the concept that water would reject a witch, because water, being pure, would not accept someone tied to dark forces. So the accused might be tied up and lowered in a way that ensured they couldn't easily swim. If they floated, well, clearly the water was rejecting them. Guilty. If they sank, the water accepted them. Innocent. Which sounds reasonable for about 3 seconds until you realize that sinking is not exactly ideal for survival. And yet, it was used repeatedly because it felt logical within the belief system of the time. These weren't random acts of chaos. They were structured, justified, explained. People created entire frameworks to make sense of what they believed was happening. Neighbors become distant. Conversations stop when you enter a room. People avoid making eye contact. It's a kind of quiet social exile. No flames, no dramatic ending, just a gradual fading from the community. And sometimes that isolation was enough, because people might confess, not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. Confession, oddly enough, could bring a strange kind of relief. At least then the uncertainty ends. The narrative becomes clear even if it isn't true. And once a confession is given, everything shifts. Because now, it's not about suspicion anymore. It's about confirmation. The story begins to move toward its more well-known conclusions. But we're not rushing there just yet. The path from accusation to punishment is long and filled with these small, mundane steps. But together they build something much heavier, something that slowly, almost gently closes in. So for now, just let that image settle. A quiet village, a whispered accusation, a person trying to explain something that cannot be proven, and a system slowly turning. We'll pick up from there and drift a little deeper in the next part. Now, let's gently continue from where we left off. That quiet room, that person sitting there, answering questions that don't really have answers. Because once an accusation of witchcraft has been formally acknowledged, it doesn't simply fade away. It tends to grow legs. Slow legs, yes, but persistent ones. And what's fascinating in that oddly unsettling way is how organized everything starts to become. You might imagine chaos, angry mobs, torches, a lot of shouting. But in many cases, it was paperwork. Careful, repetitive, slightly tedious documentation. Statements were written down, testimonies collected, names listed, dates recorded. Because if there's one thing humans love, it's turning uncertainty into a structured process, even when the structure is deeply questionable. Now, as this process unfolds, more people tend to get involved. Neighbors are called in, friends. Occasionally, people who barely know the accused, but suddenly remember something odd. Someone says, "She looked at my child strangely." Another adds, Actually, yes. My child was ill shortly after she visited. And slowly, these separate, unrelated events begin to weave together into something that feels connected. A whole tapestry of small suspicions stitched together. Up until now, the accused might still believe that reason will prevail, that if they just explain clearly enough, this will all sort itself out. But as the testimonies pile up, that belief starts to feel slightly optimistic, because the process is no longer about a single incident. In parts of Europe, witchcraft was treated as a serious legal matter, which means judges, officials, all stepping in. Not with dramatic flair, but procedural seriousness. Questions are repeated, answers compared, contradictions noted, because the accused is often asked the same questions, again and again. Subtle inconsistencies begin to appear, not because the person is lying, but because memory shifts under pressure. Details blur, timelines slip. Now, let's drift into another layer. The goal shifts slightly, from gathering information to encouraging confession. It can be psychological, isolation, limited sleep. Some people held firm. They denied everything, consistently, stubbornly, and refusal to confess could be interpreted as further proof of guilt. Eventually, physical coercion entered the picture. It was regulated. There were rules, guidelines, limitations, at least on paper. And under enough pressure, many did confess. The system wants a story. So stories are created. Meetings at night, strange rituals. Accusations lead to confessions. Confessions create stories. Stories strengthen beliefs. Beliefs lead to more accusations, and around it goes. In some cases, the punishment might be relatively mild: public penance, fines, exile from the community. The people involved didn't see themselves as cruel. They believed they were maintaining order, protecting their communities. And that belief made the system function. A system that moves slowly, methodically, almost calmly, and yet carries people toward outcomes that feel deeply unfair. We'll continue gently in the next part. All right, let's drift a little further. The room is quieter now. The questions have mostly been asked. The answers, whether consistent, confused, or forced, have been written down somewhere in careful, slightly uneven handwriting. And at this point, something subtle changes. Because the process is no longer about whether something happened. It becomes about what to do about it. Now, if this were a modern story, this is where you might expect a dramatic turning point, a sudden revelation, a last-minute rescue. But history, especially this kind of history, tends to move in a much flatter line. No sudden twists, just a steady progression. So the officials, judges, magistrates, sometimes religious figures, begin to consider the outcome. And once again, it feels strangely procedural. There are discussions, comparisons with past cases, references to established practices, because even here there is a system, and systems, even flawed ones, like to be consistent. Now let's start gently. Not every person accused of witchcraft faced the most extreme punishments. That's something people often overlook. In many cases, especially where evidence was thin or authorities were hesitant, the outcome could be less severe. A warning, a requirement to publicly admit wrongdoing, real or imagined, a fine, or perhaps exile, being told, in a very official tone, to simply leave and not come back, which, while not physically violent, is still a heavy sentence, because being removed from your home, your routines, in a time when travel was difficult, could feel like being quietly erased. You're still alive, but everything that made your life recognizable is gone. Now let's slowly shift toward the more well-known outcomes. Because yes, There were cases where the punishment became final. But even here, it's important to notice the tone. It wasn't always chaotic or emotional. In fact, it was often carried out with a kind of calm, almost detached formality, which somehow makes it feel even stranger, because you have this enormous consequence being delivered in a very measured way. Now, depending on the region, the method of punishment varied. In some parts of Europe, execution by hanging was more common. In others, burning became the associated image, and it's here that the popular imagination tends to rush ahead. But let's slow that down, because the reality in many cases was more subdued. Yes, there were gatherings, people came to watch, not always out of cruelty, sometimes out of curiosity, but the atmosphere wasn't always loud or chaotic. It could be quiet, somber even. Now, for the person at the center of it all, by this stage, they had often been through so much that their energy was low. Weeks, maybe months of questioning, isolation, pressure, the slow unraveling of their previous life. And so, when the final moment arrives, it's not always dramatic. Sometimes, it's just still. A person standing there, officials carrying out their duties, a crowd watching, not quite sure how to feel. And then it's over, not with a flourish, but with a kind of quiet finality. Now, let's step slightly to the side again, because there's another layer to this. What happens after? Because punishment doesn't just affect the individual, it ripples outward. Families are left behind. Children, if there are any, suddenly carrying a name that has been marked. Property might be taken. Homes left empty. And in small communities, that absence is noticeable. A chair at the table that no one sits in anymore. A house that remains closed. A path that no longer has footsteps on it. And people adjust, because humans are very good at adjusting, even to things that seem impossible to accept. Now let's gently explore something that often gets overlooked. The role of belief, not just in the authorities, but in the wider community. Because for these systems to function, people had to believe they were necessary. They had to feel that witchcraft was a real threat. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. A force that could harm crops, cause illness, disrupt lives. And within that belief, the punishments made sense, not as cruelty, but as protection, which is, perhaps, the most quietly unsettling part of all this. The idea that harmful actions can be carried out of a sincere belief. Now let's float over to another small detail, because not everyone watched these events with the same mindset. There were always quiet skeptics, people who weren't entirely convinced, who looked at the process and thought something feels off. But in many cases, those thoughts stayed unspoken, because questioning the system could be risky, and so skepticism existed, but softly, in the background, like a faint hum that never quite becomes a voice. Now, as time went on, these practices didn't remain static. They changed, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Some regions began to require stronger evidence, others placed limits on interrogation methods, and over time, the number of accusations began to decline, not suddenly, but slowly, like a tide pulling back. And with that shift came a change in perspective. What was once seen as necessary began to look questionable, then doubtful, and eventually unacceptable. But that transition took time, generations in some cases, because beliefs, especially deeply held ones, don't disappear overnight. They fade, they loosen, they become less certain, until one day they're no longer the default. Now, as we ease toward the close of this part, let's return one more time to that central thread. A person accused, a process that builds slowly, steadily, a system that feels structured, even when it's flawed, and an outcome that, from within that system, feels justified, but from outside feels deeply uncomfortable. And maybe that's the quiet lesson that sits underneath all of this. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. The idea that certainty can sometimes lead people down paths that later on seem difficult to understand. So, let that settle for a moment. The stillness after the decision, the empty spaces left behind, and the slow shift of time beginning to change how these events are seen. In the next part, we'll drift a little further into specific lives, individual stories, people who found themselves caught in this system, each in their own way. Some resisted, some complied, some simply endured. But for now, just rest in the quiet, and we'll continue gently from here. All right, let's continue. We've been moving through systems so far. Quiet machinery, procedures, decisions that unfold slowly, almost politely, despite what they lead to. But now let's drift a little closer to the people inside these stories, because history has a habit of turning individuals into patterns, into examples, into cases. And in doing so, it smooths out the edges. So let's gently bring some of those edges back. Not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to notice that each accusation, each trial, each outcome belonged to a real person, with a very ordinary life right up until it wasn't. Now, if you look across different regions and time periods, certain names appear again, not because they were famous at the time, but because their stories were recorded, preserved, and later revisited. One of the more well-known examples is Agnes Sampson, and even here, the story begins in a way that feels almost reassuringly normal. She was known as a healer, someone people went to when they were unwell, which at first glance sounds like a good thing. But in a world where illness wasn't well understood, healing could easily be seen as suspicious, because if you can cure something, perhaps you can also cause it. It's a strange kind of logic, but within that belief system, it held together. Now, Agnes wasn't someone living on the extreme margins. She had a role, a reputation. People sought her out, which makes what happened next feel a bit more disorienting, because her position didn't protect her. In fact, it may have made her more visible. And visibility in these situations was a double-edged sword, helpful until it wasn't. Her accusation became part of a larger wave of witchcraft fears in Scotland, and once again the process unfolded in that familiar way. Questioning, pressure, the gradual narrowing of possibilities, and eventually confession, or something that looked like one. Now, what's quietly striking about her story isn't just the outcome, it's how it fits into that broader pattern. A person with knowledge becoming a person under suspicion, a role in the community turning into a reason for doubt, and a life that once made sense slowly being reinterpreted. Now let's gently float over to another figure, Matthew Hopkins, and this is where the story shifts slightly, because not everyone involved in these events was accused. Some people made a role out of the process itself. Hopkins, for example, operated during a period of intense witch hunting in England. He essentially positioned himself as a specialist, which in a way is both fascinating and slightly unsettling, because it shows how systems can create opportunities. Even within something as serious as witch trials, there was room for individuals to step in and say, "I know how to handle this." And people listened. Because when fear is present, confidence becomes very persuasive. Now, Hopkins didn't operate with wild theatrics. He used methods that, at the time, were seen as practical: observation, questioning, testing, all framed as careful investigation. And again, this is that recurring theme, the blending of belief with procedure. The idea that something deeply uncertain can be approached in a structured way. Now let's shift once more to someone who resisted, Giles Corey. And his story feels different. Not louder, not more dramatic, just more still. Corey was an older man during the Salem trials, and when accused, he made a very unusual choice. He refused to enter a plea, which meant he didn't say guilty or not guilty, and this created a kind of legal pause, because without a plea, the trial couldn't proceed in the usual way. Now the response to this was, again, structured. There was a method designed to encourage a plea, a process that applied increasing pressure, quite literally. And Corey remained silent, not as a grand gesture, not as a speech, just quiet refusal. And that quietness is what stands out. Because in a system built on responses, confessions, statements, silence becomes unusual. Now his story doesn't resolve neatly, it doesn't offer a comforting conclusion, but it does show that individuals could respond in different ways. Some adapted, some resisted, some simply tried to endure. Now let's step back slightly. Because these individual stories share a common thread, they all move through the same general structure: accusation, questioning, pressure, decision, outcome. But within that structure, the human experience varies. And that variation is important, because it reminds us that history isn't just one continuous line, it's a collection of overlapping lives. Now let's drift into something a bit softer again, because not every story ended in the most severe outcomes. There were people who were accused, questioned, and eventually released, sometimes because evidence was lacking, and those individuals returned to their lives. But even then, things weren't quite the same, because once an accusation has been made, it leaves a trace, a memory, a subtle shift in how others see you. Now, as time moved forward, these stories began to accumulate. Records were kept, accounts written, and eventually people started looking back. Not immediately, but gradually, as perspectives changed. What was once seen as necessary began to feel excessive. What was once certain began to feel uncertain. We've seen the systems, the processes, and now the people, each one moving through that system in their own way. So just let that settle. The sense of many lives intersecting with one idea: witchcraft. But for now, just rest here, with the people behind the stories and the soft echo of their lives moving through time. All right, let's continue drifting. By now, the pattern probably feels familiar. A quiet accusation, a slow process, a system that moves with surprising calm toward very serious outcomes. But what makes this story even more unusual is how far it spread, because witchcraft accusations were not limited to one village or one kingdom, or even one way of thinking. They moved, softly, gradually, almost like fog slipping across fields, barely noticeable at first, until suddenly everything feels covered. Now, if we gently zoom out just a little, we begin to see something interesting. Different regions had their own versions of these beliefs, their own explanations, their own preferred methods of dealing with the problem. And yet, there's a kind of shared rhythm underneath it all, a similar structure appearing in different places, sometimes independently, sometimes influenced by neighboring ideas. Let's float, for a moment, into continental Europe. Parts of what we now call Germany, France, and Switzerland experienced particularly intense periods, not constant, not everywhere at once, but in waves. And these waves often followed a pattern. Social tension increases. Maybe there's a bad harvest, or illness spreading, or political uncertainty. And in those moments, people begin to look for explanations, not abstract ones, not distant theories, but something immediate, something human. And that's where accusations begin to surface. Now, here's the quietly fascinating part. Even though these regions were different, different languages, different customs, the shape of the accusations often looked similar. People spoke of harmful magic, of secret gatherings, of unseen forces influencing everyday life, which suggests something quite simple and quite human. When faced with uncertainty, people tend to create patterns that make the world feel understandable, even if those patterns aren't entirely accurate. Now let's drift slightly west toward England. Here, the approach to witchcraft had its own flavor. Trials were often more restrained compared to some parts of continental Europe. Procedures existed, but there was at times a bit more hesitation. Not always, but enough to notice. And this is where you start to see that the system wasn't uniform. It wasn't one single machine operating the same way everywhere. It was more like a collection of similar machines, each adjusted slightly differently. Some moved faster, some moved slower, some were more cautious, others less so. Now let's gently cross over the ocean to Salem, and here we find one of the most well-known clusters of witchcraft accusations. Not because it was the largest, but because it was recorded in detail and later revisited again and again. And Salem, interestingly, shows us how quickly things can escalate. What begins as a few unusual behaviors becomes a growing concern, then a community issue, then a full series of trials. And once again, the same familiar elements appear. Testimonies, confessions, pressure. But there's something slightly different here, a sense of acceleration, as if the process, instead of unfolding slowly over years, compresses into a much shorter span. And when systems move quickly, they often become less careful, less reflective, which can lead to outcomes that, even at the time, made some people pause. Now, let's step back again, because what we're really seeing is not just a set of isolated events, but a kind of shared human response. Across different places, different cultures, different circumstances. A response to uncertainty that looks remarkably similar. Find a cause, identify a person, create a structure, follow it through, and within that structure, people act in ways that feel logical from the inside. Now, here's something else worth noticing. These beliefs didn't spread like a sudden explosion. They didn't appear everywhere at once. They traveled through conversations, through writings, through the movement of people. Ideas, after all, are quite mobile. They don't need roads or ships, just someone willing to repeat them. And over time, these ideas became more detailed, more structured, more official. Books were written, guidelines established, methods discussed, and what began as scattered beliefs gradually took on a more defined shape, which, again, made everything feel more certain, more grounded, even if the foundation was less solid than it appeared. Now let's gently explore the role of authority again, because as these beliefs spread, institutions began to engage with them more directly. Courts, churches, local governments, each bringing their own perspective, their own priorities, and sometimes their own skepticism. Because not everyone within these institutions fully agreed on how to handle witchcraft. There were debates, quiet disagreements, different interpretations, but those debates didn't always stop the process. They just shaped it, adjusted it, gave it slightly different forms in different places. Now, as time passed, something subtle began to happen. Not everywhere at once, not in a dramatic shift, but slowly, almost quietly. People started asking different questions. Not who is responsible, but are we certain this is happening at all? And that question is a turning point, because once doubt enters the system, even softly, it begins to change things. Procedures become stricter. Evidence is examined more carefully. Confessions are questioned, and gradually, the number of accusations begins to decline. Not because belief disappears overnight, but because certainty weakens. Now, let's pause here for a moment, because this transition is important. It shows how systems built on belief can also be reshaped by belief, just in a different direction, from certainty to doubt, from action to hesitation, and eventually from practice to memory. Now, as we ease toward the end of this part, let's return to that image of fog, because it works in both directions. Belief spreads like fog, softly, gradually, hard to notice at first, and then, over time, it lifts, not all at once, but slowly, revealing a different landscape underneath. And in that new landscape, people begin to look back, at the systems, at the stories, at the individuals, and wonder how it all seemed so certain at the time. So just let that settle. The sense of something spreading and then receding, the quiet movement of ideas shaping lives across regions, and the slow shift from unquestioned belief to careful reflection. In the next part, we'll drift into that reflection, how later generations looked back on these events, how they tried to understand them, and how the legacy of these accusations continues to echo even now. But for now, just rest in that quiet transition, the fog beginning to lift. All right, let's continue. The fog we were just sitting in, it doesn't disappear all at once. It thins, it drifts, it leaves behind shapes that look a little unfamiliar, even though they've been there the whole time. And that's where we are now. Because at some point, people began to look back at these witchcraft accusations, not as current events, but as something slightly distant, something worth questioning. Not loudly, not all at once, just small, careful thoughts appearing here and there. Was that really necessary? Were we certain? Did we get it right? And those kinds of questions tend to linger. Now, this shift didn't come from a single moment. There wasn't a dramatic announcement where everyone suddenly agreed to stop. Instead, it grew out of broader changes in how people understood the world. Ideas about evidence, about proof, about cause and effect began to evolve. And as those ideas changed, so did the way people viewed witchcraft. Because once you start asking for clearer evidence, things that once felt obvious begin to feel less solid. Now let's gently drift into that space. Courts that once accepted confessions without much hesitation begin to pause. Officials who once followed established procedures begin to question them. And slowly, the system that seemed so certain starts to feel a little uncertain, not broken, just less convincing. Now, let's float over to a specific moment. Salem witch trials. We've already touched on Salem, but here we're not looking at the accusations themselves. We're looking at what came after, because in the years following those trials, something unusual happened. People began to express regret, quietly at first. Officials acknowledged mistakes. Some of the individuals involved admitted that the process had gone too far, which is not something you see very often in systems that once felt completely justified. And yet, there it was, a kind of slow collective realization that maybe things hadn't unfolded as they should have. Now, this doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't undo the outcomes, but it does mark a shift from certainty to reflection. Now, let's step back again. Because Salem wasn't the only place where this happened. Across different regions, similar patterns began to emerge. Accusations declined, trials became less frequent, and eventually, they stopped altogether. Not because people stopped believing in strange or unexplained things, but because the connection between those beliefs and formal punishment weakened. And once that connection breaks, the system loses its momentum. Now, here's something quietly interesting. Even as the trials faded, the stories remained. They were written down, retold, studied, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes simplified, but always remembered. And over time, those stories began to serve a different purpose. Not as instructions, but as examples, as reminders of what can happen when belief and certainty go unchecked. Now, let's gently consider how later generations approached these stories. Historians, writers, thinkers, all looking back and trying to understand. Not just what happened, but why. Why did so many people believe so strongly? Why did the systems feel so convincing? Why did it take so long for doubt to emerge? And the answers are rarely simple, because this isn't just about one idea. It's about a combination of things: fear, uncertainty, social pressure, authority, tradition, all blending together into something that feels solid until it doesn't. Now let's float into a slightly quieter thought, because while it's easy to look back and say, that doesn't make sense, it's worth remembering that at the time, it did. Not perfectly, not universally, but enough that people acted on it. And that's something history gently reminds us of, again and again. That certainty is often shaped by the context we're in, by what we've been taught, by what those around us believe. And when that context changes, certainty can shift, sometimes quite dramatically. Now let's return briefly to the individuals, because even as systems faded, the lives affected by them didn't simply reset. Families carried memories, communities carried stories, and those stories became part of local identity, sometimes spoken openly, sometimes kept quiet, but always present in some form. Now, as we move closer to the present, the tone of these stories changes again. They become subjects of study, of books, of discussions, and occasionally of reflection on broader human behavior. Not in a dramatic, moralizing way, but in a quiet, observational sense, looking at the past and noticing patterns, patterns of belief, patterns of reaction, patterns of how people respond to uncertainty. Now, as we ease toward the end of this part, let's bring everything together, softly. We began with accusations, moved through processes, followed individuals, watched beliefs spread. And now, we're sitting in the aftermath, a place where the system no longer operates, but its echoes remain. And those echoes don't shout. They don't demand attention. They just linger, in records, in stories, in the quiet understanding that history is full of moments where people acted with certainty and later questioned it. So just let that settle. The sense of looking back, not with judgment, but with curiosity, and a quiet awareness of how easily belief can shape action. In the next part, we'll drift into those echoes a little more. How these events are remembered today, how they're interpreted, and how they continue to appear in subtle ways in modern thinking. But for now, just rest here, in the calm after the storm that never quite felt like one, and the gentle, persistent question: how did it all seem so certain at the time? All right, let's continue. By now, the noise of the past has faded. No more questioning rooms, no more quiet judgments being written down, no more slow, procedural decisions moving toward their end. What's left instead is something softer, an echo, not loud, not demanding, just present. Because even though the witch trials long since ended, the ideas behind them didn't simply disappear. They changed shape, they softened, they slipped into different parts of human thinking, and that's where things become quietly interesting. Because when we talk about what happened to people accused of witchcraft, we're not only talking about the past, we're also talking about patterns that continue to exist, not in the same form, not with the same outcomes, but in ways that feel faintly familiar. Now, let's ease into this slowly. Think back to those early accusations, the whispers, the small complaints that slowly built into something larger. She's strange. He behaves oddly. Something about them feels off. And how those small observations gradually formed a narrative. Now, without rushing, it's worth noticing that this kind of pattern hasn't entirely vanished. Humans still look for explanations, still connect unrelated events, still build stories out of fragments, and sometimes those stories become very convincing. Now, let's be clear. We are not drifting into anything dramatic here, just a quiet observation that the human tendency to seek patterns, to assign meaning, hasn't really changed, only the context has. Now let's gently return to how these historical events are remembered today. Because over time, the witch trials have taken on symbolic meaning. They're often used as examples of what can happen when fear and certainty combine, of how systems can reinforce beliefs, even when those beliefs are questionable, and of how individuals become caught in processes. But even here, the tone has softened. These stories are no longer told with urgency. They're told with reflection, with a kind of calm distance. Now, let's float over to something a bit more subtle, because memory is selective. Not every story from this period is widely known. Some are repeated again and again. Others remain quiet, tucked away in records that few people read. Our understanding is shaped by what has been preserved and what has been emphasized, which adds another layer. Because history isn't just what happened, it's also what is remembered and how it is told. Now, let's gently consider how these stories appear in modern culture. Books, films, conversations. They often highlight the more dramatic elements, the trials, the punishments, the intensity. But, as we've been exploring, the reality was often slower, quieter, more procedural, which doesn't make it less significant, just different from the usual image. Now let's drift into one final reflection. At the center of all of this is a simple, slightly uncomfortable idea that people, acting with complete confidence, can create systems that later on feel difficult to understand. Not because those people were different from us, but because they were responding to their world in the way that made sense to them. And that thought tends to linger, not loudly, just gently. Now, as we begin to wind down, let's return to where we started. That quiet village, that single accusation, the slow unfolding of events, and the person at the center of it all, trying to navigate something that didn't follow reason. And then, the wider system, the procedures, the decisions, the outcomes, and finally, the fading of it all, leaving behind stories, records, and a quiet sense of reflection. So, as you settle in, maybe feeling a bit more relaxed, just let the final thought drift through, not as a conclusion, not as a lesson, just as a soft observation. That history often moves in slow, quiet ways, and that sometimes the most significant things don't feel dramatic at all. They feel ordinary, until they're not. And with that, we'll gently bring this story to a close. No sudden ending, no final statement, just a slow fade into stillness and the quiet echo of a time when certainty shaped lives in ways that still feel faintly present. Good night. So, you are born. There is no announcement, no royal trumpet, no neat little birth certificate tucked into a tidy archive. Just a cramped wooden hut, a rush of cold air, and a mother who is already exhausted before you even arrive. Somewhere outside, a chicken complains about something deeply unimportant, and your father is probably pacing, in a way that suggests he is both concerned and mildly inconvenienced. Welcome to life as a medieval peasant child. You do not enter a world of soft blankets and gentle lullabies. You enter a world that smells faintly of smoke, damp straw, and whatever the family goat has recently decided to contribute. Your cradle, if you are lucky enough to have one, is more like a wooden box with commitment issues. And already, quietly, without anyone saying it out loud, there is a question hanging in the air. Will you survive? Childhood in this era is less a guaranteed phase of life and more an optional trial period. Illnesses drift through villages like uninvited guests who refuse to leave. Clean water is a vague concept. Medical knowledge is creative. If you cough, someone might suggest herbs, or prayer, or possibly both, just to cover all bases. But for now, let's assume you are one of the lucky ones. You make it past those early, fragile months. You continue breathing. Your earliest memories would be of sensation, the rough texture of wool, the warmth of a fire that never quite heats the whole room, the constant presence of people, because privacy is not really a thing here. Your entire family shares the same space. You are rarely alone, not because people are especially attentive, but because there is simply nowhere else to go. As you grow, the idea of childhood as a protected time does not exist. You are being prepared for work. Survival here is a group project, and everyone eventually is expected to contribute, even you. At first, your tasks are small. You might be asked to watch the chickens, which are deeply chaotic creatures with no respect for authority. You might gather sticks for firewood, always aware that wandering too far is not a great idea. There are things in the woods. Fetching water becomes one of your early responsibilities. It sounds simple. Walk to the well, fill a container, carry it back. But the container is heavy, the path is uneven, and water, inconveniently, does not stay still when you carry it. Still, you learn because you have to. There is no structured schooling for you, no classroom. Knowledge is passed down through observation and repetition. You watch your parents, you imitate them. Reading and writing are not part of your daily life. For you, intelligence is measured in practical terms. Can you do the work? Can you remember what needs to be done? Can you avoid getting injured while doing it? Food is not guaranteed. It is seasonal, unpredictable, and often repetitive. Bread is a staple, though it is not soft and fluffy. There are vegetables. Cabbage makes frequent appearances. Meat is rare, reserved for special occasions. As a child, you learn not to be picky. You eat what is there, or you do not eat. You wake with the light, because candles are expensive. You sleep when the day is done, because there is nothing else to do. There are stories, though. Tales of saints, spirits, strange happenings in nearby woods told by the fire. As a child, you listen closely. They shape your understanding of the world. They explain things that cannot easily be explained. Your family is your center. There is a kind of quiet closeness that comes from shared struggle. You work, eat, and endure together. As you move further into childhood, the expectations grow. You are stronger now. The tasks become actual contributions. The work is repetitive, physical. It stretches on for hours under a sky that does not care how tired you are. Dig, plant, cover, repeat, over and over, until the light begins to fade and the world shifts into that quiet space between day and night. There are days when things go wrong. Crops fail. Weather turns suddenly. Illness sweeps through the village again. You begin to understand, slowly, that life here is fragile, like a thread that holds everything together, always at risk of fraying. As you approach the later years of childhood, something shifts. You are no longer seen as just a child. You are becoming useful. There is a quiet pride in this, a sense that you are becoming part of the machinery that keeps everything running. So let's ease into that next stage, where childhood doesn't quite end, but simply fades into responsibility. And just like that, without a ceremony, without a speech, without even a particularly memorable Tuesday, childhood begins to fade, not dramatically, not in a single moment where someone taps you on the shoulder. It just thins out, like mist in the morning. One day you're chasing a chicken in mild confusion, and the next you're expected to understand crop rotation. By now, your body has stretched into something more capable. Your hands are rougher, your steps are steadier, you don't spill quite as much water anymore, and the adults around you have noticed. They don't congratulate you, of course, but they do something more significant. They start relying on you. And reliance, in a medieval village, is a form of trust. Your days are no longer filled with helping. That soft, forgiving word quietly disappears. Now you are working, properly, fully. Fields don't tend themselves. Animals don't politely feed themselves. Everything requires effort. Consistent, repetitive, slightly exhausting effort. Morning arrives early. You wake up to the same familiar smells, smoke, earth, and whatever yesterday's dinner left behind. You eat something simple, bread, maybe a bit of porridge. It is not exciting, but it is functional. Then you step outside into a world that is both vast and incredibly small. Vast, because the sky stretches endlessly. Small, because your world is limited to this village, these fields, these few familiar faces. Roads are unreliable. Time is valuable. And honestly, there is just too much work to justify wandering off. If it is planting season, your days are filled with the steady rhythm of preparing the soil. You dig, you sow, you cover. If it is harvest season, things become more intense. Crops must be gathered before weather or bad luck interfere. Everyone works longer, faster. There is less talking, more doing, and you keep up, because you have to. A blacksmith might take on an apprentice, and suddenly your world shifts from fields to fire and metal. The forge is hot, loud, and terrifying. Sparks fly in ways that feel personally directed at you. Tools are heavy. Instructions are brief and delivered with the expectation that you should understand them. You probably don't, but you learn. Back in the village, family life continues. But you might notice subtle changes in how you are treated. You are included more. There is also a growing awareness of the future. Adulthood arrives early, and it brings responsibilities with it. Winters can be harsh. Long, cold stretches where food becomes scarcer and the world feels smaller, tighter. In those quieter months, there is a different kind of work. Mending clothes, repairing tools, preparing for spring. You also become more aware of illness. Someone in the village falls sick. Sometimes they recover, sometimes they don't. As you grow older, these experiences shape you. You become practical, observant, resilient in that quiet, unremarkable sense. And occasionally, there are moments of something close to joy. A festival, perhaps. A rare break from routine. You might dance. For a brief time, the weight of daily life lifts slightly. Not gone, just lighter. So you are no longer quite a child, not fully an adult either, but standing somewhere in between, capable and aware. Let's keep moving into that next stage where roles become clearer and the path ahead becomes unmistakably yours. And now, without much ceremony, you arrive at that quiet threshold where nobody really calls you a child anymore. Not because there was a big announcement. No one gathered the village together and said, "Everyone, please note, this person is now officially grown." That would be far too organized. Instead, it just sort of happens. One day, someone hands you a task that used to belong to an adult, and no one checks if you can handle it. They assume you can, and that assumption is your promotion. By this point, your body has adapted to the rhythm of work in a way that feels almost automatic. You wake up early because your internal clock has surrendered to reality. Your muscles know what to do before your mind fully catches up. There is a strange efficiency to your movements now. You don't think about each action, you simply do it, which is good. Because there is a lot to do. If you are working the land, your responsibilities are now constant and fully your own. You are no longer the helper trailing behind. You are part of the main effort. You understand the soil, at least in a practical sense. You know when it feels right to plant. You notice when something seems off. Maybe the ground is too dry. Maybe the crops look slightly unhappy. And unfortunately, crops do not explain what is wrong with them. So you guess. You adjust. You hope. Hope is actually a surprisingly large part of agricultural strategy at this time. And then there are the animals. By now you are probably responsible for some of them. Chickens, perhaps. Maybe a goat, if life has decided to give you a slightly more chaotic challenge. Animals have personalities. You discover it slowly as one particular goat develops a habit of testing your patience on a daily basis. You feed them. You watch them. You try to keep them from wandering off into situations that will become your problem. It is a quiet, ongoing negotiation between you and creatures who have absolutely no interest in your schedule. Still, you manage. If your path led you into a trade instead of the fields, things look a little different. You are now expected to produce something of value. If you are a blacksmith's apprentice, you are no longer just observing. You are shaping metal. Your early attempts probably looked like someone had a disagreement with a piece of iron and lost. But over time, your hands learn the pressure, the timing, the rhythm of hammer on metal. The forge becomes familiar. If you are a carpenter, you understand wood in a way that feels almost personal. You know how it splits, how it bends. Your tools are extensions of your hands now. Not perfectly controlled, but close enough. And slowly, quietly, you become good at something. Not extraordinary, not legendary, just good. And in this world, that is more than enough. Back in your family life, the shift is even more noticeable. You are part of the decision-making process. Your opinions carry a little more weight, enough that people listen, at least briefly, before continuing with whatever they were already planning to do. You are no longer being shaped. You are contributing to the shaping of everything around you. And then there is the matter of marriage. It approaches quietly, like most things in your life. No dramatic build-up, no grand romantic gestures. Two people working together are more effective than one. Households need to be formed. Life needs to continue. So conversations begin. Practical discussions. Who brings what? What skills are involved? What arrangements make sense? Eventually, you are included. Asked, perhaps, what you think. Though the question may feel more like a polite formality. Marriage, when it happens, is not a dramatic transformation. It feels like a continuation, just with more responsibility layered on top. You share your work, your space, your daily routine. You build something together. Slowly, through repetition and effort. And if children arrive, you find yourself standing in a very familiar position, watching a small, fragile life enter the world. The cycle continues. But let's not rush too far ahead. Life remains unpredictable. There are still bad harvests, still sudden illnesses. You handle these moments the way you have always handled things. You keep going. There is a kind of quiet resilience inside you. Evenings, for example. When the work is done and the light begins to fade, there is a brief window where everything slows down. You sit, you eat, you talk maybe, or maybe you just exist quietly in the presence of others. There is comfort in that. Festivals still come and go, small breaks in the pattern, moments where the village gathers, where music returns. You might laugh. Not loudly, not for long, but enough to remind yourself that this is not just survival, something like living. This is your life, not chosen exactly, but not entirely resisted either, simply accepted. And the life of a medieval peasant continues, one quiet, repetitive, oddly resilient day at a time. At some point, you stop counting the years in any meaningful way. Not because you don't know your age, technically. If someone asks, you can give an answer, but it doesn't feel important anymore. Age is less a number and more a vague suggestion that you are older than you used to be. Instead, you measure time in other ways. Harvests, winters, births, losses, the slow repetition of work that never really changes shape, only intensity. A good year feels like one where things didn't fall apart too badly, and life continues to move forward with that same quiet inevitability. By now, your role in the village is fully established. You are no longer being trained, no longer being shaped. You are part of the structure itself. One of the many small, essential pieces. It is not glamorous, but it is stable. And stability in this world is not something to dismiss lightly. Your mornings are predictable now. You wake, you work, you eat, you work again. The rhythm is so ingrained that even on days when something unusual happens, the underlying structure remains untouched. You simply adjust around it. If a tool breaks, you repair it. If weather interrupts your plans, you shift accordingly. If illness passes through, you continue forward. Always work. And somewhere along the way, this becomes strangely comforting. Predictability becomes its own form of security, even if that predictability is exhausting. Let's drift for a moment into the household itself, because your domestic life has likely expanded. There is always someone moving, speaking, or existing in the same small environment. Privacy is a luxury item that was never stocked. You learn to carve out small internal spaces instead, moments of quiet in your own mind while life continues around you. Adaptation. If you have children, life takes on an even more repetitive rhythm. You watch them grow through the same stages you once passed through. They begin with small tasks, watching animals, carrying things, learning by imitation. And you find yourself doing what others once did for you, correcting, guiding, occasionally sighing when something gets broken. There is a strange loop to it all. A sense that the village is constantly regenerating itself, even as individuals come and go. And then there are the seasons of hardship. A poor harvest hits differently now. You know what it takes to stretch food, to ration supplies, to adjust expectations downward. You don't panic. Panic is not particularly useful here. You adjust. Again. There is a certain emotional economy to medieval life. You do not waste energy on reactions that do not lead to solutions. So instead, you focus on what can be controlled, and what cannot be controlled, you accept. Not gracefully, necessarily, but practically. Let's float to something slightly softer. Life is not entirely defined by labor. Evenings, when the work is done, everything slows down. You sit, you eat, you talk maybe. Or maybe you just exist quietly in the presence of others. There is comfort in that familiarity. Festivals still come and go, small breaks in the pattern, moments where the village gathers and music returns. Music appears again. Simple instruments, familiar tunes, communal participation. Everyone knows at least part of what is happening. And for a short while, the weight of daily life loosens. You move to a rhythm that has been repeated for generations. You realize that this is one of the few times the entire village feels like a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. Then, of course, it ends, and everyone goes back to work, because that is the structure. By now, you see the older generation differently. People who once seemed simply adult are now visibly aging. More rest required. There is no formal retirement. People simply reduce activity as they are able, until they can't. It is a gradual transition. increasing reliance on others, including you, which means your responsibilities expand again, and you take them. There is a quiet understanding of where you sit within the cycle. You were once dependent, then capable, then responsible, and now essential. The village runs in part because you are here doing what needs to be done, grounding and slightly heavy. Still, there is no time to dwell too long on abstraction. The next task always arrives, and so you continue, not in a story of triumph or downfall, but in something far more common, a life that simply persists, approaching the later stages of existence, where repetition deepens and meaning becomes clearer not through change, but through endurance. Somewhere along the line, you stop feeling young, not in a dramatic way, no sudden realization in the mirror, no shocking moment of transformation. It is more like waking up one day and noticing that your body now requires a bit more negotiation than it used to. A little more stretching before work, a little more awareness of joints, a little less enthusiasm for unnecessary running, because frankly, running is for emergencies and children, and you are trying very hard not to be either of those things. And just like that, you've entered the stage of life that medieval storytellers don't really bother naming. There are kings in their glory, saints in their suffering, knights doing knight things in questionable armor. And then there is you, still here, still working, still quietly holding everything together in a way nobody will ever write a dramatic ballad about. Because honestly, local Peasant continues to function, doesn't sell very well as epic poetry. Your days at this point are deeply predictable. And strangely, that predictability is what keeps everything from falling apart in your mind. Wake up, work, eat, work. Brief pause where you stare at something in the distance for no reason. Work again. Return home. Repeat. It is not exciting, but it is stable. And in your world, stability is not boring. It is valuable. Your skills are now fully formed. You don't learn anymore in the way you once did. You refine, you adjust, you notice smaller details. The way soil behaves differently depending on rainfall patterns, the way certain tools wear down faster than others, the way people in the village change their routines subtly over time without ever announcing it. You become observant in a way that doesn't feel intellectual, but practical. Survival-based awareness. You know things without needing to explain how you know them. And this quiet competence is what defines this stage of life. Let's drift slightly into your household again, because by now, whether your family structure is traditional or expanded, it has settled into something familiar. There is a rhythm to shared living that no one formally organizes, but everyone follows anyway. Who wakes first? Who handles what tasks? Who speaks to whom when decisions are needed? It is not written down anywhere, but it is understood. And that understanding is what keeps things moving smoothly. There are fewer surprises now. Even arguments, when they happen, tend to follow predictable patterns. Small disagreements about workload, about timing, about resources that always feel slightly insufficient no matter how well things are managed. But they pass, because they have to. There is no energy for long conflict in a life like this. Too much depends on cooperation. And so, you continue in a state of managed balance. Not perfect harmony, just functional coexistence. Let's float over to the village itself, because by now, you are not just living in it. You are embedded in it. You know everyone, or at least you know of everyone. You recognize patterns of behavior, seasonal habits, familiar routines. You can predict with reasonable accuracy who will complain about what during different times of year. There is a comfort in this familiarity, a kind of social map that exists entirely in your head. New people occasionally enter the village, through marriage, travel, or necessity. and they disrupt things slightly, not in a dramatic way, but enough that you notice, because change at this stage of life feels more noticeable than it once did. You remember when you were the younger one, the one being observed, guided, quietly evaluated. Now you are the one doing the observing, which is not something you consciously decided. It just happened. Time did that thing it always does. There are moments now when you find yourself thinking in longer arcs, not just about today or tomorrow, but about patterns over years. You remember past harvests. You compare winters. You notice which changes are temporary and which are part of a slow shift you can't quite reverse. This is not philosophy. It is just experience accumulating. And experience, in your case, is practical. Your body, meanwhile, is still working with you, but no longer effortlessly. There is a kind of mutual agreement now. You will continue to function, and in return, it will occasionally remind you that it has limits. Nothing dramatic, just small reminders. Slower recovery, slight fatigue after long days. The awareness that rest is not optional anymore, but necessary maintenance. So you rest when you can, not because you are lazy, but because you understand consequences better now. There is also a subtle shift in how others treat you, not out of respect in a formal sense, but recognition. You are no longer one of the younger workers. You are part of the established structure, someone who has seen enough cycles to be trusted with judgment. People ask you things, small decisions, practical advice, not always because you are the only one who knows, but because your perspective is now seen as reliable. And you answer, usually without much ceremony, because that is how communication works here. Let's gently drift into something softer again, because even in this stage of life, not everything is labor and responsibility. There are still evenings, still moments where the work is done and the day loosens its grip. You sit, you eat, you listen to the familiar sounds of people around you doing the same. The fire still burns. Conversations still drift. Sometimes they are about practical matters. Sometimes they are just noise that fills the space comfortably, and occasionally there is silence that doesn't feel heavy, just present. In those moments, there is a strange awareness that life, despite everything, is not just endurance. It is also accumulation of habits, of memories, of small shared experiences that don't feel important individually, but together form something like a life. Not a heroic one, not a tragic one, just a lived one. Festivals still arrive. Though your participation has shifted slightly, you are no longer in the energetic center of things. You are more steady presence, observing, participating when appropriate, stepping back when needed. Music still plays. Children still run around in ways that suggest they have not yet fully understood gravity or consequences. The village still, briefly, feels lighter. And you notice that you enjoy these moments differently now. Not with youthful excitement, but with quiet appreciation, because you understand their temporary nature. And then, as always, it ends, and life resumes its normal shape. Work returns, responsibility returns, the cycle continues. There is a point in this stage where you begin to notice something else too. The next generation is no longer just children. They are becoming what you once were, capable, useful, slightly impatient, learning through repetition and necessity, watching the world in a way that feels familiar because you recognize it in yourself from years ago. And without anyone stating it out loud, something begins to shift. You are no longer the future of the village. You are part of its continuity, a stable point in the middle of everything. And so, quietly, the story continues to move forward. Not toward dramatic change, but toward deeper layers of the same existence. A life built not on milestones, but on repetition that somehow becomes meaning. And as we drift further, we begin to approach the final stages of this long, uncelebrated journey, where time slows differently and the world narrows into something smaller, quieter, and unexpectedly reflective. There comes a point where you realize something slightly strange. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic life flashing before your eyes kind of way. It's quieter than that. More like noticing that the same road you've walked for years now feels a bit longer than you remember. Not because it changed, but because you did. Your world, once defined by effort and movement and constant obligation, begins to shrink in a very specific way. Not geographically. You are still in the same village, the same fields, the same worn paths that have seen more seasons than you care to count. But physically, you move differently now. Slower, more deliberately. Less because you want to conserve energy, and more because your body has started negotiating terms before agreeing to anything. It is not rebellion, just polite resistance. And so begins this new stage of life, where you are still present, still useful in your own way, but no longer expected to carry everything. The younger ones handle more of the heavy work now. The tasks that once defined your days are gradually redistributed. You still work, of course. That doesn't stop. Not here. Not ever, really. But it changes shape. Less intense field labor. More oversight, more guidance. More pointing out things that used to be done differently in a tone that you try very hard to make sound helpful. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. You accept both outcomes. Let's drift gently into your daily rhythm, because even now, structure remains the backbone of everything. You wake up, as always, but there is less urgency in it. Fewer immediate demands waiting at the door. You take a moment, sometimes longer than a moment, depending on the stiffness of your joints and the weather's personal attitude that day. Breakfast is still simple. It has always been simple. Bread, porridge, whatever is available and not actively suspicious. Then the day unfolds. But now, you are not always at the center of it. You observe more than you intervene. You notice patterns in the younger generation that feel familiar. The same impatience, the same assumption that they understand more than they actually do. The same gradual realization that experience is not something you can shortcut. You don't correct everything. You've learned better than that. Some lessons only land when lived. Still, you offer guidance when asked, or when something is about to go mildly wrong. And sometimes you are listened to, which is its own quiet satisfaction. Let's float over to the household again, because here too things have shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. The space feels both familiar and slightly rebalanced. Roles have adjusted themselves over time without formal discussion. You are still part of everything, but not responsible for all of it anymore. There is a kind of ease in that. You are no longer constantly calculating the next task. There is room now for pauses that don't feel like inefficiency, just pauses. And in those pauses, thoughts tend to wander. Not in an anxious way, more in a reflective one. You think about earlier versions of yourself, the child fetching water, the adolescent learning labor without understanding its full weight, the young adult trying to build stability out of repetition and necessity. And you realize something quietly obvious. All of them are still you, just arranged differently in time. Let's gently drift outward again, into the village itself. The social landscape has changed around you. It has simply continued evolving while you stayed in place long enough to notice the difference. People you once worked alongside are now in similar stages to yours. The village feels layered now, different generations overlapping, and you are part of the older layer, not ancient, not removed, but established. When decisions are made, your voice carries weight. Not authority in a formal sense, but trust. The kind that comes from simply having been there long enough to see consequences unfold more than once. You don't need to insist. People already assume you've seen how things tend to go, and usually they are not wrong. There is a quiet dignity in this stage of life that is easy to overlook if you are only looking for excitement. It is not loud, it does not demand attention, but it holds things together in ways that are only visible when you step back. You are part of that holding. And then there are the seasons, which continue their endless rotation. Winter still arrives with its familiar heaviness. Summer still pushes work into long, tiring days. Spring still brings that brief sense of renewal that everyone quietly relies on, even if they don't say it out loud. But you experience them differently now, not as obstacles to manage, but as cycles you've lived through enough times to recognize. There is comfort in that repetition, even when it is difficult, even when it is cold, especially when it is familiar. Let's soften for a moment, because even in this stage, life is not entirely defined by decline. There are still moments of warmth. You sit in the evenings more now, not because you have nothing to do, but because you have learned the value of sitting without urgency. The fire still burns. Conversations still drift around you. Sometimes you speak. Sometimes you simply listen. Both feel equally valid. There is less pressure to fill silence. Silence, you realize, is not emptiness. It is just space without obligation. Occasionally you find yourself laughing at something small, a memory, a comment, a familiar joke that has probably been repeated for years. Not because it is new, but because it is shared. And shared things tend to feel lighter. The younger ones move around you with their own energy, their own belief that time is something they have an abundance of. You watch them without envy, without resistance, just recognition. You were them once, and they will eventually be you. Not in exact detail, but in structure, in rhythm, in the gradual understanding that life is not a single long sprint, but a series of stages that quietly hand themselves off to each other. And so, as we drift further into this final stretch of the journey, the focus shifts once more, from doing to observing, from carrying to having carried, from building a life to seeing how that life has already been built. And what remains now is not urgency, but continuity. At this stage of life, there is a very specific skill you develop. It is not taught, not named, not celebrated in any obvious way. It is simply the ability to still be here, not in a heroic sense, not in a standing against fate kind of way, more in the quiet, unremarkable sense of continuing to exist inside a world that no longer asks you to rush. You are still part of things, just not in the same way as before. Your mornings begin slower now, not because time has changed, but because your body insists on a more negotiated agreement with it. You wake, you sit for a moment, you listen to the sounds of the household or village starting its day without immediately jumping into it. There is no urgency pressing you forward anymore. And strangely, that feels both unfamiliar and entirely earned. Work still exists, of course, it never truly leaves, but it no longer defines you in the same total way. It is something you participate in, not something that consumes you completely. You might still tend a small part of the fields, or oversee certain tasks, or simply ensure that things are being done in a way that won't create future problems you will absolutely be asked about later. But the physical weight has shifted elsewhere, and you notice this, not with sadness, not with relief, just awareness. Let's drift gently into your physical world for a moment, because it too has become something different. Your hands, once constantly in motion, now rest more often. They still know their work. That does not disappear. But they are no longer always required to prove it. Your body carries memory now more than momentum. You know how to move efficiently, but you also know when not to move at all. That is a skill younger versions of you would have considered suspiciously close to laziness, but you now understand as conservation. Energy is not infinite. It never was. You just used to pretend it might be. There is a quiet honesty in this stage of life that is easy to miss if you are only looking for dramatic change. Nothing is being taken from you suddenly. It is being returned, slowly, in pieces. Time, effort, responsibility. And what fills that space instead is observation. You notice things you did not notice before, not because they were hidden, but because you were too busy to see them. The way light falls at certain times of year across familiar ground. The way sounds carry differently depending on season. The way people's voices change as they age through their own cycles. You become more aware of continuity and of repetition, and somehow that repetition stops feeling like monotony and starts feeling like structure. Let's drift into the village again, because your place in it now has a different texture. You are known, not in a dramatic, important sense, just known. People recognize you not as a function, but as a presence, someone whose absence would be noticeable in a subtle way. You are part of the background stability, and that is not a small thing. Younger people still come and go with their urgency, their plans, their assumptions about how long things will take. You watch them with something that is not quite amusement, not quite nostalgia, but a quiet understanding. They are living at full speed. You are no longer required to, and both are valid in their own time. Occasionally, someone asks you about the past, not history in the grand sense, but your past. What things were like before certain changes, how work used to be done, what winters were harder, what methods worked better. You answer if you feel like it, not always fully, not always with detail, but enough. And you realize sometimes mid-sentence that you are now the reference point, not the learner. That shift happens so quietly, it almost escapes notice. Let's ease into your inner world for a moment, because this stage of life is often more internal than external. There is more remembering now, not in a painful sense, just naturally. You think back to earlier versions of yourself without judgment. The child learning work without understanding its permanence. The younger adult trying to build stability in a world that never promised it. The midlife version of you carrying responsibility like it was simply part of the body. All of them feel both distant and familiar, like different rooms in the same house. You don't visit all of them often, but you know they are there. And occasionally, something in the present echoes one of them so clearly that you pause for a moment without realizing why. Let's drift back outward again. The seasons still pass. That has not changed. It never really does. But your relationship to them has softened. Winter is no longer something to endure in the same urgent way. Summer is no longer something to push through. Spring and autumn are no longer simply markers of labor cycles. They are rhythms you exist alongside. Not obstacles, not interruptions, just time doing what time does. There are still responsibilities, yes. There always will be in some form, but they are lighter now, shared more widely, distributed across generations that continue the cycle you once carried more heavily. And that realization brings a strange kind of calm, not pride exactly, not detachment either, just perspective. You were part of something that continues without needing you to hold it alone anymore, and that is enough. Let's settle gently into the evenings again, because they have become one of the clearest expressions of this stage of life. Evenings are slower now in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental. You sit, you observe, you listen. The world does not demand your constant participation anymore. It allows you to simply be present within it. Sometimes conversation drifts toward practical matters. Sometimes it drifts toward nothing at all. Both feel fine. Silence, once something to be filled, now feels like something to rest inside. And in those moments, there is often a quiet awareness that nothing dramatic is happening. And yet, everything important is still continuing. Life is not ending, it is just narrowing into clarity. Fewer extremes, fewer urgencies, more presence. And so, as we move deeper into this final stretch of the journey, the focus shifts one last time, from participation to observation, from building life to witnessing its continuation, and from being necessary to simply being here. At some point, you realize something that would have sounded almost insulting when you were younger. Nothing dramatic is going to happen today. And more surprisingly, that is completely fine. In fact, it is better than fine. It is preferable. Because nothing dramatic now translates to no illness sweeping through the household, no urgent repairs collapsing into your morning, no unexpected shortages forcing everyone into panic mode. Just the day, doing what days do. You wake up and the world is still where you left it, which, in your earlier years, would have been considered suspiciously calm. Now, it feels like stability. Your mornings are unhurried in a way that younger versions of you would not have recognized as legitimate life. There is no rush to prove usefulness within the first few minutes of consciousness. No immediate pressure to transform yourself into productivity. Instead, there is space. Not empty space, just unclaimed space. You sit, you think, or you don't think, which is equally acceptable. And then, eventually, the day begins. Work still exists, of course. It always will. But now it arrives in softer waves rather than constant demand. You are no longer the primary engine of activity. You are more like maintenance, oversight, a quiet corrective presence when needed. You still know how to do things properly. That doesn't leave you. But you also know when it is no longer your turn. And that knowledge is oddly peaceful. Let's drift into the village again, because your relationship with it has settled into something very specific now. You are no longer the center of its motion. You are part of its memory, not forgotten, not sidelined, just integrated into its structure. People still greet you, still ask you things, but the tone has shifted slightly. Less instruction, more acknowledgement. You become someone whose presence is expected, even if not always consciously noted. Like a familiar building you stop consciously looking at. There is a strange comfort in that kind of existence. No pressure to define yourself constantly. You simply are, and that being is enough. Let's gently move into the younger generations again, because they continue the cycle with the same energy you once carried. They move faster than you do now, carry the same mixture of confidence and inexperience that you once had without realizing it. You watch them, sometimes amused, sometimes quietly reflective, not with judgment, more with recognition, because you remember exactly what it felt like to believe that effort alone would solve everything, that the world would remain predictable. And you know now how that belief slowly softens into something more complex. Not cynicism, just understanding. Let's drift back into your daily life because even now, routine remains the backbone of everything. You still contribute, just differently. Maybe you help organize, maybe you repair, maybe you simply ensure that things are not drifting too far from what experience tells you. Your effort is measured less in output and more in presence. And strangely, that presence matters more than you expected it to. Because in a world built on repetition, continuity is valuable. Someone who has seen cycles before becomes a kind of living reference point. And reassurance, in a life where unpredictability still exists in smaller forms, is not trivial. Let's ease into something softer again. Evenings once more, but now with even less urgency. You sit, you listen. You exist among others who have also slowed down. There is less need to fill silence now. Silence is no longer awkward. It is simply part of the environment. And in that silence, memories tend to surface without effort. Not painful ones, just pieces of time. You realize slowly that your life is no longer something you are actively building. It is something you are carrying, not as burden, but as accumulation. Let's drift outward again, because time in the village continues its familiar layered motion. People age, roles shift. You have seen enough to know patterns, but not so detached that you no longer care. That balance is delicate. And then there are the seasons, still turning, still repeating, still indifferent to individual experience. They are markers of continuity. Something changes when you spend long enough simply continuing. You stop expecting your life to become different in dramatic ways. Instead, you start noticing the value of what already is. The routine, the familiarity, the predictability, stability you finally understand is not the absence of change. It is the presence of enough continuity to make life livable. So as we drift toward the final stretch of any long, uncelebrated journey, the focus narrows even further. From doing to remembering, from changing to continuing, and from living a life that demands constant effort to one that simply remains. At this point, life stops introducing itself to you. It doesn't announce new phases. It doesn't hint at transformation. It doesn't even bother with the illusion that something important is about to happen. Instead, it just continues. And you continue with it. There is a strange honesty in this stage of existence, a kind of quiet stripping away of everything that once felt urgent. Ambition, in the youthful sense, has already been replaced by something more grounded. Responsibility has softened into familiarity. Even uncertainty has lost its sharp edges simply because you've met it enough times to recognize its patterns. Now, most days are not events. They are repetitions. And yet, they are not empty. That is the subtle part people often miss when they imagine a life like this. From the outside, it might look monotonous, a loop, a cycle, a slow drift through identical days. But inside it, there is texture. You notice small differences that once would have been invisible. The way a particular field responds differently after certain weather. The way conversations shift subtly depending on season. The way people's moods align with rhythms they don't consciously acknowledge. Life becomes less about what happens and more about how it continues. You wake up, and your first thought is no longer about conquest. It is about what simply needs maintaining. And that shift changes everything. Let's drift gently into your physical world again, because your body has become a kind of companion at this stage. Not a demanding one anymore. More like an old, reliable tool that still works, but requires respect rather than force. You don't rush it. You don't push it unnecessarily. You've learned the difference between effort and waste. Movements are measured. Tasks are chosen more carefully. There is no longer an invisible expectation that you must prove endurance every day. That phase is over, and in its place is something quieter. Sustainability. You work when work is needed. You rest when rest is reasonable. You avoid unnecessary strain because you understand cost in a deeper way. Energy is not infinite. It never was. You just finally stopped pretending otherwise. Let's drift into the village again, because your place within it now feels almost architectural. You are part of the structure, not in the sense of importance alone, but in the sense of stability, like a familiar beam in an old house that everyone relies on without thinking about it directly. People still come and go around you. Life still moves. But your presence has become something steady within that motion. Not the center, not the edge, just continuity. You are the person who remembers how things were done before certain changes, the one who can quietly confirm whether something is new or forgotten. That kind of memory becomes valuable over time, not because it is dramatic, but because it is rare. Let's gently move into your interactions with others, because by now they have taken on a particular tone. Less instruction, more exchange, less hierarchy, more familiarity. People approach you as someone who has already been through enough cycles to make judgment useful, even if briefly. You answer questions, you share observations. You sometimes shrug and say, "It tends to go like this," which is about as close to prophecy as it gets. There is a calm efficiency to communication at this stage of life. No excess explanation, no performative certainty, just lived understanding. Let's drift into memory for a moment, because that is where much of your inner life now resides. Not in a nostalgic or emotional sense necessarily, but in a structural one. You recall earlier versions of the village and yourself. You see patterns now that you couldn't see while inside them. The urgency of youth, the weight of early responsibility, the gradual settling of adulthood, the slow redistribution of effort as generations shift. It all makes sense in hindsight, and you realize something quietly simple. Nothing ever truly stopped changing. It just stopped changing in ways that demanded your full attention. Let's drift outward again. The seasons continue their rotation, but your reaction to them has changed almost entirely. Winter is no longer a trial. Summer is no longer an endurance test. They are just weather patterns you have lived through many times. You prepare, you adjust, you continue, without drama, without resistance. And that lack of resistance is not resignation. It is familiarity. There is a difference, even if it looks similar from the outside. Let's settle into the evenings again, because they have become the clearest reflection of this stage of life. Evenings are no longer pauses from work. They are simply part of the day's rhythm. You sit, you listen, you observe the quiet hum of life settling down around you. Conversations drift in and out. Sounds soften. The fire holds its place in the center of everything, as it always has. There is comfort in that repetition. You are not waiting for change. You are resting inside continuity. And that rest is deeper than it used to be. Occasionally someone speaks about the past, not as history but as lived memory overlapping with yours. You add small confirmations, adjust details, fill in gaps that others no longer remember clearly, and in those moments you become something slightly unusual in this world. A living archive, not formally, not dramatically, just naturally. And that role, like all the others you have had, was never assigned. It simply formed over time. Let's gently begin the final shift of this stage, because something subtle has now fully settled in. You are no longer imagining your life as a sequence of upcoming changes. You are experiencing it as a continuous present. Not because the future has disappeared, but because it no longer feels separate enough from today to demand anticipation. There is only the ongoing moment, repeating in slightly different variations. And within that repetition, you find something unexpected. Not excitement, not sadness, just recognition. This is what it has always been. And so, as we drift toward the final stretch of this long journey, the focus narrows even further, from experience to presence, from living through time to existing within it, and from a life defined by stages to one defined simply by still being here. There isn't a final chapter in the way stories like to pretend there is. No moment where everything neatly stops and the world politely waits for a closing line. Life doesn't really do that, especially not here. It just slows down in places, quietly, gradually, until you realize you've been in the later part for longer than you noticed. You don't wake up one morning and feel like the end has arrived. You just notice that everything around you has become smaller. Your movements are slower now, but not unfamiliar. They are the same movements you've done thousands of times before, just softened, economized. There is no rush in your body anymore, not because time is gone, but because urgency has finally left. You still wake with the day, as you always have. That part never really changes. But the day no longer feels like a struggle. Some days you do a little work. Some days less. Some days mostly nothing at all, except being present in the space. And strangely, nothing breaks because of it. The world continues anyway. Others carry on. Younger hands take over. The rhythm of life absorbs your reduced pace without complaint, and that is not failure. That is how it was always meant to function. Let's drift into the village one last time, because by now it feels less like a place you live in and more like a part of you. The edges of your world are unchanged, but your position within it has shifted into something almost invisible in its steadiness. People still pass by, still work, still argue about small things that matter intensely in the moment. Children still grow into the same cycle you once grew into. New families still form. Old ones still fade into memory. And you are there, in the middle of it, like a quiet reference point no one needs to name. Let's drift inward now, because most of this stage of life happens there. Inside memory. Inside observation. You remember earlier versions of yourself less as past selves and more like different weather patterns in the same sky. Storms, clear days, long winters, brief springs of energy and ambition, all of them real, all of them gone. There is no forward pull left, only presence, and presence, you realize, is enough. Let's settle into the final quiet rhythm of your days. Morning still comes. That never changes. You sit more often now, not out of inability, but out of preference. Standing, moving, acting, all still possible. You observe the household, generations overlapping, life reorganized around itself again and again, as it always has. It is just life doing what it does. And then there are the evenings. Still the same fire, still the same slow conversations, but now you notice them differently. Silence feels complete now, not empty, not awkward, just complete. You did not achieve something in the way stories usually demand. You did not rise. You did not fall. You simply continued, through seasons, through roles, through stages that came and went without ceremony, not a hero, just a person who existed fully within their time, carried their share of it, and passed it forward. So now there is nothing left to conclude dramatically, only the same thing that has always been true. The world continues. And you simply lived in it.